let you choose your colour. Now, I deliberately didn't put them on the sides that they probably fit, because I thought I'll get some wrong and then you'll come and tell me afterwards, well, actually, I think they're kind of in the middle. And ironically, some of them are on the wrong side. But just some of the places. I mean, let's admit it, most of you are getting your news from Facebook and Instagram, so I probably shouldn't have put all these news. Is anybody reading them? I noticed that great. Hands up if you still read a newspaper regularly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's amazing. Most people are of a certain generation. That's interesting. So, interestingly, the Observer makes their website look like the newspaper, which I thought was interesting. I was like, they really don't want to let go of that aesthetic. In recent weeks, the BBC has been getting a lot of flack, and possibly some deserved, possibly some not. It's well known that there are other news organisations that would like to see the end of the BBC, and so the BBC end up having to report about them, the bad things they've done themselves, because other people are reporting about it also. So BBC's having a hard time, but because of that, bias has been in the news a lot, especially people criticising the BBC for different sorts of bias. This came up in one of the Bible studies this week, which is why it was on my mind. And I was talking about, I watched Krish Kandaya, who's a Christian commentator, being interviewed on GB News. He's not a natural fit for GB News necessarily, but that's why he goes on. And he accused them, the person interviewing him, he said to them, well, before we start talking about bias in the BBC, maybe we want to talk about, how silly that is on this show. And then it was an interesting answer, though, because what she said is, yeah, but we don't pretend to be impartial. We're very open about coming from a particular political persuasion, but the BBC is not allowed to. So it was a very interesting conversation. You will look at this and you will have an idea of the different political persuasions, the different biases. If we looked at one story, there's an interesting app called Ground News, which allows you to compare a headline from all the different news outlets and see what slant they took on an article. There's that famous one about, Europe cut off. Is it Fog on the Channel, Europe cut off? Which is obviously very British-centric. So you probably know better than I do that most of our news is not unfiltered. Even from those outlets which are supposed to be the most unbiased, it appears at times that the bias will creep in. None of you are this old, but it used to be that we believed in objectivity. What came out of the Enlightenment was an approach that you could be completely objective. Science was therefore considered much more important than anything else because science was believed to give you objectivity. But one of the good things, there's lots of not great things, but one of the good things of later developments in philosophy has been the understanding that pretty much nothing is unbiased. Pretty much nothing is unbiased in the way it's reported. When I studied geography, this is a long 30 years ago now, one of the things we looked at was ethics. And one of the stories was that during I think it was the Second World War, while they were, the Royal Geographic Society, or whatever they were called at the time, were out making maps, but the maps they were making were the completely wrong scale to be any use for military, because the maps they were making were for how to carve up the Middle East and other parts after the war. So while in the middle of fighting, they were making maps that were no use for the people on the ground fighting, because these were the maps for politicians to draw lines around and say this is. So nothing comes to us completely unbiased or without an agenda. And that goes for Bible study too. And so the reason I bring it up is that the study of the Old Testament has a whole history of its own. And after the Enlightenment, increasingly people said, well, how can we believe the Old Testament? Because we can't prove scientifically the things that happened in it. Now, it turns out there's a lot of things you can't prove scientifically that are really important. And also, it's a bit unfair to put modern approaches to history to pre-modern or very, very, very ancient documents that were not written with that in mind. But it has led to a lot of skepticism. if we can push away the skepticism, because from the reading I've been doing this week, as far as I can see, it really depends where you start. It's not really so much about the evidence as what you thought when you started reading it. If you believe in God and you believe in miracles and you believe that God can do anything, then you will find it much more reliable than someone who starts off and says, prove to me that miracles happen, prove to me that this thing happened in the Old Testament. And so if you start within the church from a point of trust in the Old Testament, then you will get a lot more. Not only is it God's truth, but you will get a lot more from it than if you ask it to prove to you in a way that it was never written to prove to you. However, that aside, there are very interesting things you can do with Scripture which are completely useful to us. And one example is, in the Old Testament, you have from Genesis to Kings or Joshua. So you have this chunk of narrative that goes from the creation story all the way to the kings of Israel just before the exile. But then you come to Chronicles, as we have. And what you find in Chronicles is you start again. Do you remember we went right back to Adam? And we then looked at, we've got in Chronicles, we're not going to do it because if it takes us 3 weeks to do the first chapter, then just to think where we'll be. But in Chronicles, you go from Adam right through the same story. Obviously, much quicker. It's a little bit like the recap at the beginning of a show, but much quicker you go through it. And then you come to post-exile. So you go right through Chronicles, you get the whole story again, and then you come to Ezra and Nehemiah, which are the story of the exiles coming back from Babylon. So you have these two different versions of the same story. And when you have that, it allows you to compare them. It's the same with the Gospels. When we have 4 Gospels, and I've always wondered, just as I wonder why God gave us 2 history stories, I've always wondered, why did he give us 4? It would be a lot easier to just have 1. Answers on a postcard. I mean, there's lots of answers. One of them is, he just did. But having 4 allows you to compare them. And having these 2 histories from Genesis right through to Kings and from, or even Judges, and then from Chronicles through Ezra and Nehemiah, it allows us to compare the stories. And when you compare the stories, what you find is that the writers told them slightly differently. And that's okay. For someone coming from a very scientific or an extreme end who says, well, unless you can prove it to me scientifically, I can't believe this. Yes, there will be issues for you to when you look at the text. But when we compare the 2 texts, it allows us to see what was the author thinking when he wrote this down. He or she is not trying to write modern history, but he is trying to write truth, and he is trying to tell us about what has happened and what has been handed down to him over a long period of time. And it allows us to say, why did he write the story this way when it wasn't written that way in Genesis? So the point is, in Chronicles, you have stories that are told in Genesis, and they're told differently. Sometimes some bits are missed out in Chronicles. It's like the abridged version. As you can see, the first few chapters, the first 8 chapters of Chronicles does what the whole sweep of Genesis right through does. So obviously, it's told differently. But there are interesting things you can tell from how someone tells you a story. As I said, in the New Testament, it's interesting to compare how Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John deal with similar stories. It's interesting to think, what were they trying to communicate to us? Some of today is going to recap what we said before, because a few weeks ago what I said is the chronicler, the person writing Chronicles, seems to be writing for when they've come back from exile or just before they've gone. So, and if you don't know what exile is, we covered it last year, but exile is when systematically they are taken from about 500 BC, the Jews or the Israelites are taken away from their country to Babylon and to Assyria. Interestingly, a few weeks ago I kept calling them the Jews instead of the Israelites. It's after they come back from exile that they're more often called the Jews, the Yehudi or Yehuda. Before they went away, not so much, but when they come back, the tribe of Judah seems to be the main name for the tribe. So the chronicler is writing to them when they come back from exile, and he's trying to communicate to them a message through their history and through a retelling of their history. And we're going to read it, if this works. Can you do it, please? I will abridge this. We're going to miss bits out. So 1 Chronicles 1:34-37. We read this bit last week. Abraham was the father of Isaac, the sons of Isaac, Esau, and Israel. Now we're moving on. Esau's sons. The sons of Esau, Eliphaz, Reuel, Jeush, Jalam, Korah, the sons of Eliphaz, Teman, Omar, Zepho, Gatam, and Kenaz. By Timnah, Amalek. Now, the Amalekites come from there. Timnah, in some of them it doesn't have the by. It just says Timnah, and that's confused people because Timnah was actually a concubine of Esau, not one of his sons, okay? So the NIV corrects it and says, by Timnah, Amalek. And then a concubine of Eliphaz, I should have said. And then the sons of Ruel, Nathan, Zerah, Shammah, and Mizah. Now we can keep going. Actually, could you click it? But later on, we move on to a section called the sons of Seir, Lotan, Shobal, Zibeon, Anah, Dishon, Ezer, and Dishan. Then we move on in 43 to, these were the kings who reigned in Edom before any Israelite king reigned. Bela, son of Beor, whose city was named Dinhabah. And then we move to 51 to 54. The chiefs of Edom were Timnah, Alva, Jetheth. Oh, come on. Let's call him Obama. Oh, holy Obama. Elah, Pinon, Kenaz, Teman, Mibzar, Magdiel, and Eram. These were the chiefs of Edom. So, if we had time and we compared the story in Genesis to the story in Chronicles and how it's told, we would notice some interesting things. For a start, it is interesting that there's so much focus on Esau. So Esau is the one that's rejected, although the way the story is told, you're meant to feel sorry for Esau. But Esau is the one that's rejected and Israel's the one that's chosen. And yet Chronicles spends quite a lot of time talking about Esau. In there you've got Seir. Now Seir is actually related to the land. So we actually move from Esau's children to a new person who is from Edom called Seir. So although we start off saying the sons of Esau, now we're talking about people from the land of Seir. And then we jump on to the kings who reigned Edom. As I said last week, Edom is another name for Esau, and it's the name of the area that he moved to and took over. So we moved from Esau's family to the sons of Seir, who's a different family. Then we moved to the kings of Edom, and then we moved to the chiefs of Edom. So one, there's a big focus on Edom, and much better Old Testament scholars than me have pointed out, at least one part of this, is the focus on Edom because they're actually marking the boundaries of the new kingdom when they come back. So this is them coming back from Babylon. They want to re-establish themselves. They're building the temple. They're rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. And now they're marking their territory. So Edom, as well as being a relation of Abraham, Edom marks this edge of the nation. Also interesting is that he starts off talking about kings and then he starts calling them chiefs. In other parts of Scripture, I think in Genesis, in other parts, these guys are chiefs at the bottom. So Timnah, different Timnah, Alva and Jetheth, they're not chiefs, they're kings elsewhere. So some people think the writer of Chronicles is dissing the Edomites. He's demoting them. When David comes along and becomes the king of Israel, it changes from kings to chiefs because David is now the main person and Edom is being pushed down a little bit. Another thing I've stolen from somebody in the Old Testament scholars, Chronicles makes the main person the last person he mentions. And so after all this big chunk on Edom, we then come to Isaac. So although we've got a lot about Edom and Esau's family, the main character is Isaac. That's just a little bit of the bias of the Chronicles and where they're coming from. Just because they have a slant or a reason for writing doesn't mean it's not true. I'm not going to click back to that picture. You can work out for yourselves, even though every single one of those outlets has a bias, some of them will be more truthful than others probably, and you will have your own opinions about which ones are more truthful than others, and I won't be able to tell you. So just because there's some kind of bias doesn't mean it's not truth. Just because the writer of Chronicles has a reason for telling the story in a slightly different way doesn't mean it's not true. It just shows us that he has a purpose. And what we believe is the purpose of the second telling from Chronicles on of the history of Israel is to encourage them when they come back from Babylon and they're ready to re-establish their nation. Can you do this one? Okay, that's a reminder. Can you play the video? Simon enjoyed the map so much last week that I thought I'd put some more in. Can you put the next image on, please? So the reason we went through that is to show you that you will be well aware what the boundaries of Israel are right now because you cannot miss it on the news. And they're kind of limited to not even all of that blue of Israel and Judah, but some of it. So it's much, much smaller. But the Davidic kingdom is enormous. It reaches all the way down here to, I think, the Arabian Gulf, but it's right down to Edom. He either took over or made vassal kings out of Moab, Ammon, Aram, and right up to the river Euphrates at the top. So you can see that at its height, the kingdom of David and Solomon was pretty enormous in Israelite terms. Obviously, in global terms, not so much, but it was huge. Perhaps that helps us understand what Chronicles is trying to do. Chronicles is trying to encourage them that they will be able to establish themselves the way that they did. The messianic figure they're waiting for, the rebuilding of their nation, is because they want to rebuild the kingdom. They want to reestablish temple worship. The reason that he puts a big emphasis on David and Solomon and gets rid of the bad bits of their stories and only tells the good stuff is because he wants to really encourage the people on return from exile. You're coming home and you can reestablish what you had before. We can be a great nation again, as the song goes. And so, you just have a look at that. That's all the way down to Egypt and all the way up into Syria to the river Euphrates. That was how much land that they had. However, did it work out that way? I keep hoping, don't I? So the temple's built. This, I think, is Herod's temple. This is not the temple that Nehemiah built, but this is when Herod improved it around about the time of Jesus. Quite a spectacular building. I've not been. Some of you have been to Jerusalem, and you know that there's not much left at all now. But certainly they re-established the temple. So they built the walls of Jerusalem, as we know from Ezra and Nehemiah. They re-established temple worship. So things were, in some senses, going pretty well. Habit. But it doesn't quite go to plan. They don't manage to re-establish the Davidic kingdom. In fact, various other people come along, most well-known being the Roman Empire. And look at the enormity of that. We know it went further. All the way from not quite Scotland to Egypt, Armenia, beyond, all the way up into, this doesn't do Europe, so all the way up into Europe, the Roman Empire. And so, at the time of Jesus, the temple's rebuilt. But they're not self-ruling. They have not re-established David's kingdom. They don't have their own king. They don't have their own boundaries. They haven't managed to push out invaders. In fact, they're back under another superpower, just like they always have been. And they're miserable. And so, as we said recently, you'll see that there were lots of messianic figures. There were uprisings against the Romans. And ultimately, the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in AD 70. And so they didn't manage to achieve what they wanted to achieve. In one way, the end of the Old Testament is unfulfilled. Chronicles was written to give them this great hope that they would re-establish the kingdom, that they would be autonomous, that they would have their own king, that they'd get rid of all the invaders and oppressors. But actually, end of the Old Testament, they haven't. And so they're still waiting. I should really throw this away. Here we go. For a Christian, all of this serves to show the reason that Jesus was so heavily anticipated. We obviously come from it, most of us are Gentiles, we come from it from a different perspective, but the Jews had been waiting and waiting and waiting. They were waiting for the promises to be fulfilled. They were waiting for the freedom, the autonomy, the ability to control their own affairs, to be free from oppression, the ability to worship freely. I mean, they were allowed to worship often in the Roman Empire, but they want freedom. They want autonomy. They want restoration. At the time of Jesus, this is what the Apostle Paul was waiting for. One writer has said that Paul recognized one day that in Jesus Christ, all of the promises and the hopes were fulfilled. The Pharisees, according to N.T. Wright, were waiting for the resurrection of Israel. That's what it would have been. To restore the Davidic kingdom through fulfillment of Torah would have been the resurrection of Israel. And instead, it didn't happen the way they hoped. It happened to one man, a representative of Israel, right enough, but also more than that. And so for Christians, what we recognize is that the kingdom that they were waiting for is even bigger than anticipated. It's the entire universe. The kingdom of Jesus Christ is the entire universe. Just to consolidate what we talked about last week, Jesus said that he would replace the temple. So the temple was rebuilt, but it was destroyed again, never to be rebuilt, or not yet. But there's no need to rebuild it, because Jesus Christ has already rebuilt it in himself and through his church. He is the temple where God is met. He is the Torah giver. He is the sacrifice beyond all of the temple sacrifices. He is the king that they were waiting for to re-establish them. What might we say that could mean for us? Have a think. All of this is a long time ago, and it might not seem relevant to you in the same way. But don't you feel the need for freedom sometimes? Don't you feel heavy burden sometimes? Don't you feel the weight of your sin and your failure? Do you ever feel afraid or insecure? Do you ever feel that the world is completely beyond your control? Do you ever feel that you have little involvement almost on the way that the world is developing, or even how your own life is going? Because in one level, you are seeking, and I am seeking, the same things that the Jews were waiting for. They wanted some level of control, or at least some level of predictability or security. They wanted to be reconciled with God and reconciled with one another. They wanted stability. They wanted hope. And while we might no longer look to the establishment of a physical kingdom or a land or a temple, we still seek the hope that only Jesus Christ would ever fulfill. The whole sweeping story, the whole history told twice, the whole Old Testament for Christians comes to a point in the story of Jesus Christ. And then we see in him the fulfillment of all the things that were hoped for. And some of those are just common to human beings. They're not specifically Israelite. And so we're encouraged through this story to see that all the things, the good things that we hope for, the peace, the security of having your own home, safety, well-being, health, what the Jews call shalom, all of this is provided in Jesus Christ. Let's pray.